We are live in the Asia Tech podcast studio. This is Asia Matters, and we are here with my very esteemed guests on a Friday afternoon. And I'll just do a quick round-robin introduction, and we'll dive into the top stories of the hour in Asia and why we need to know about these stories. I'm going to start over there. Frank Lavin, a well-known face in Singapore, and welcome to the first live show here in Asia Tech Podcast.
So glad to be here. Thank you for having me on.
I'm glad that you're here because, as I was saying to you just off air, I saw you. I was traveling and I was in a hotel room, and as usual, switch on the news on rotation, and there you were.
It made your day, I'm sure.
It did. It made my day. I can't get away from the man.
Bucket list.
Exactly. But I love the fact that you're now here in a studio which costs less than $10,000.
Well,
so
now my bucket list is complete.
There you go.
It's a win-win.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great to have you here. Unmish Parthasarathi, how you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. You must be breathless after saying that surname, but
How you
doing well?
correct me?
No, you were right.
Oh, I'm all right. Okay, I've been practicing it all day.
It's funny because it's very phonetic.
Right.
It's Parthasarathi,
Parthasarathi.
and it's having lived in Japan, it's a very phonetic language as well.
Right.
So, but yeah, I've been called worse, but no.
There you go. Well,
glad to be here and to echo
I
what Frank was
passed the
saying.
test. Mr. Cricket, obviously, people know you in Singapore for your connections there. I mean, I think as well, anybody that lives in Singapore, the law here is that you're only ever 1 degree of separation away from Unmish. Everyone seems to know this guy, right? So
I'll assume that's a compliment rather than an observation.
it's a good thing. It's all good. It's all good. Michelle Wonderland, great to have you here.
Thank you. I'm 1 degree away from Unmish.
There you go, in a good way. And obviously you spent a lot of your career in media, in traditional media, if I can say that. And you're very much, what I'm impressed about you and your background, you're very much a disruptive force in a positive way. You like taking on a challenge and reinventing yourself.
Yeah. I had a lot of really, really excellent experiences. I love being in the studio. I love what you've done with it. And yeah, I mean, it's, media keeps changing, and we have to keep evolving with the media. So, whereas 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, it keeps getting disruptive by these different technologies. And it's exciting to be a part of that.
And here we are, in the middle of it, disrupting. So let's talk about the change. I'll kick off today because I've got some stories about Asia and talent. And it's always a big subject, isn't it? When we've always sort of thought of Asia as supplying talent to the West, quote unquote. And now we're sort of seeing this interesting reverse of direction. So in terms of how the format works today, I'll introduce my stories, and then I'll open it up to all of my guests here to introduce their stories and talk about why we need to know these stories right here, right now. So Barrett, let's kick off. If we can get these stories up on the screen, the monitor here. Let's talk. There was a really interesting story coming out this week about Australian universities. And the reason why I want to share this one is they are saying that they're under threat from cheaper Chinese competitors. Now, we always think about China as competition in terms of the warehouse and production and the factory, but never in terms of education. And what's interesting now is that a lot of your Australian universities are finding it hard to get Asian talent. So, for example, the story here is about some Indonesian students who have chosen to go to China rather than go to Australia. And they're saying the data here from this study is that 18,000 Indians are now at Chinese universities, and that's more than in Britain, right? And Britain was always like a traditional sort of jumping off spot for young Indian talent.
More Indian nationals studying in China than in the UK.
That's what it says, yeah.
That is a surprise. I would not have guessed that.
Yeah.
I mean, but it strikes me that it might not have a lot to do with the cost structure or the pricing. It has to do with the fact that China is viewed as a country of economic promise.
That's interesting that you say that, because I'm finishing up a program in a Chinese university. Right. I am foreign, and the cost is a factor, but also because I'm really mesmerized by China business, and so I'm doing a program that's kind of geared toward people like me who want to go to Jiao Tong University in Shanghai.
No, but I suspect that that's what's motivating the Indian students as well. They're simply saying there's a lot of economic dynamism in China, and I've got to figure out some way to come to terms with that. So I want those skills. Whereas if I go to Australia University, I'm not necessarily getting collateral sort of benefit insight from Australian business with that.
Do you think that would hit, like the big sort of like brand universities in the US, for example, the Harvards and the Yales? I mean, they're always going to compete, but there must be a sort of a strata of other universities that are finding now. For example, if I wanted to learn AI or data science, where would I go? Surely China must be there must be a generation of people now coming through who are making a choice, whereas before they didn't have a choice, right? If you were young, Australia was, an option. US was default, right? But China was never an option.
I think it's a combination of factors. I think there are three factors. One, to Frank's point, you can think long about the country where you go to study at. Right? I did my undergrad in Delhi. I did my postgrad at Cambridge, and then I lived in London for 10 years. Given the geopolitics, that may not necessarily be an option in these times. That's one factor. The other factor, I think, to your point, is much more in terms of it is the new promised land. Growing up in Delhi in the 80s, the US was the new promised land. And that's, again, going back to the sort of the shift in the axis. And the third bit is just access and affordability. I think to your point...
How do they compare, like, cost-wise? Can we put a number on it? I mean, you've got an idea, but what's the factor? A factor of 2 or 3 or what?
You can, for about half the cost, sometimes 70% of the cost.
Wow.
So, but also what's being introduced now, which I find is really interesting with technology, is that a lot of these are developing MOOC programs where you can attend Oxford, you can attend Harvard, and you can do a diploma or a certificate program. You can also, especially for higher degrees, you can go and spend 30% of your time in residence where you can do the rest of it online. And so that's one thing that makes something like going to study in China more attractive, also because of the effect that China is having on the world in business.
Fascinating. This whole sort of movement of talent from outside of Asia into Asia and then within Asia is a bigger story, isn't it? Because that will have ramifications.
Well, and the ability of these institutions to compete globally. Historically, they've had sort of a population catchment and a brand, and it's been a very stable market. And now you say it's a footloose consumer base now. It's a global consumer base, a global marketplace. So I was in the U.S. Commerce Department post 9/11 when there's that drop off in foreign students come to the U.S. So we worked with the U.S. student about how many of you have web pages that are in foreign languages? How many of you do podcasts or broadcasts that are in foreign languages? And we did a satellite broadcast to China featuring Chinese kids at U.S. schools talking about their day and had the camera follow them around for a day, do some show and tell, just to put, not so much for the applicants, but their family, their parents, put them at ease to say you can have a great experience in America. But the point is you better undertake outreach. Even if you have a fantastic brand like Cambridge, you better start communicating with these population groups if you want to win that competition.
I think dominance is not guaranteed.
I
think quality is not guaranteed. Crucially, I think relevance is not guaranteed because of the dynamism of the multiple pieces. I mean, in our world, Michelle, what Frank did was content marketing.
Right.
15 years ago, before the phrase was intended, where it was more about telling a story in the first person, human interest, not scripted, but sort of saying, this is what it's like. The other way to look at it, look around us, look around this table. Only one person was perhaps born in this country. And if you think long, there's probably a lot of us who are saying, I'm here for a decade, if not longer, which was perhaps not the case 15 years ago. And so I think there's a lot of evolution, and a lot goes back to sort of, where the ducks get aligned. One last one on China, which I was intrigued by, and I think is going to come to the story I'm going to share, is I think China is going through a shift, and you probably know a lot more about this, where the value proposition is no longer about product and manufacturing. The value proposition is on service, and then service-driven innovation. And if you look at education, it's a service business, as opposed to Foxconn or any of the other manufacturing or the Walmart suppliers. That's a seminal change in the economics of the business.
Well, that's a good bridge. I think, we talk a lot about this as the service-led industries coming out of China, and we're seeing, like, for example, like retail as a service coming out now. Well, you never would have thought about this was the country that we knew as producing T-shirts and cheap trainers and sneakers, right? Now is leading the world in retail and experience. All right, Unmish, because you set this up so nicely, let's jump into your story. So if you can open that one, Barrett, if we can go back to the monitor with the last one. So what's going on here? So help us understand. So these are maybe companies that some of the listeners and watchers may not be familiar with, so assume that we know nothing.
So sort of if you assume that the sort of 2 or 3 strands that you mentioned today about, the China-US trade tensions, the talent piece, and Asia and tech and innovation, this story sort of is at the crossroads of all 3 of them. It's and again, this is always it's a tricky way of describing something. It's the Netflix of China. iQiyi, have I got the pronunciation right?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. And it's about how iQiyi has basically been able to identify a plot line with certain characters and certain narrative, which is in hindsight deemed was at the beginning deemed a bit a departure from the norm. They didn't have any major stars in the cast. And all of that was on the back of data and AI, using viewer habits and viewer preferences and viewer comments. The second thing which comes up from a talent perspective is this is an entertainment business, and they have put a cap on a per episode fee for an actor, and they put a cap on a per season fee of an actor.
Who puts that on?
The commissioner. The platform. Right. And it's phenomenal because the per episode fee is $145,000.
Why would they do that? What's the benefit?
Well, if you look at any talent-driven business, I think European football, classic example, the clubs aren't necessarily profitable because the money all goes to the fans, goes to the players. And therefore, the only way you can make a business is by creating value and capturing value. That gives you margin. A lot of talent businesses create value, but the capturing of the value becomes very concentrated in the talent. So the platform and all the ancillary economy around it doesn't have a chance to sort of take off. So if you keep, like your business, if you keep your costs anticipated and sort of year on year, but everything else, the upside, therefore, is a very positive. It's a virtuous cycle because margin impacts higher.
You encourage Graham to cap our fees at $145,000.
We said a coffee. That was it, right?
Right.
and all we got was a bottle of plastic water.
We had to negotiate harder.
Even that's because he's got a product promotion deal with said brand. Other than that,
so why is China specific to that story? What is it about that platform and the way China's doing it as opposed to how it's happening elsewhere?
I think, like the previous round of the conversation, it's about the confluence of trends. The digital footprints of the Chinese consumer of content, or the Chinese consumer per se, is now probably a decade old. The ability to understand, articulate, and transcribe those sentiments through AI, machine learning, computer vision, whatever the case might be, the technology has been around. And the fact that they are no longer looking at production, which is in China for the Chinese audience, using Chinese inputs. I was at Content Asia, which is an industry event promoted by Janine Stein last Tuesday, and there were instances of Pearl, which is Alibaba company, commissioning content using a Cantonese drama script, but using Korean creative values, and directed by a Chinese American from USC in California. So 3 things. 1, in terms of the digital footprints. 2, in terms of making sense of those footprints with technology which exists. And 3, the creative juices and combinations are very different. And that's what I think makes China quite unique.
Yeah. I think also because there's such access to data. There's so much access to data in China that you don't have necessarily in Western countries. And so you have the ability to be able to scale these types of AI projects a lot quicker and faster, and you can be a lot more agile because you have so much data. And that's what gets really exciting about looking at a story like what you've presented.
And I think to build on Michelle's point, Amazon, to my mind, is perhaps the only company which would have the competencies to be able to harness these 3 trends in an American context. Because they have the data, they have the technology to make the data intelligible and then do something about it.
Do Asian companies, particularly Chinese companies, have an advantage over their Western counterparts because they have access to consumer data which the others could only dream about? Or, what's the reality here? Because a lot of people talk about AI, big data, and retail experience and so on. Maybe we can shed some light.
I don't think so. Dial back 20 years ago. Tesco under Terry Leahy was fundamentally built on creating a loyalty program called the Tesco Club Card. And you had insights from there. Walmart was very similar. So there's always been the existence of data. Credit cards, very similar in banks. There's always been the existence of offline data as opposed to online data. But I think the scale at which you can aggregate, make sense, and put it to multiple users. I think the third point is pretty key in the digital space. Amazon puts it to multiple users.
I'd also add in China, unlike other developed markets, there's frequently not an embedded incumbent. There's not a dominant analog or traditional incumbent. So in the television space, it just doesn't have the traction with the public because it's all state-run television, so they can't hint at scandal or intrigue or sexual encounters or something. But of course, offline you can do all of that, or online you can do all of that stuff. So they they're more nimble, right? They can be more creative and more experimental. The online place rather than these massive CCTV jigsaw puzzle productions. So.
And also, I think culturally, I think that the audiences in China are, because they don't have the background of having the development of the West, everything right now is new. It's right here and right now. And I think that that's what's, you can use that data in a way that, yes, you did have in the West. You know, you have your loyalty cards, you have all of the different marketing programs, but these have evolved in a different way. So in China, everything is new, and society, culture, much more open to how their data is being harvested, how they're actually, you know, consuming media. And to
the point about the incumbents, I think that's really good, because if you take a very tangible example here in Asia, which is quite personal to everybody, and that's healthcare. For example, Thailand is like the world leader, or in the top 3 for medical tourism in the world. And if you were to go to Bangkok Hospital 20 years ago, you're sort of like, your images of going to Bangkok Hospital would be pretty terrible, right? Even though how true they are, we don't know. If you were to go there now, you go to a medical institution which is built around the idea of, you're a customer, you're here, and this is an experience, you know. And Medicare or healthcare obviously has a lot of vested interest, right? So now a lot of people are choosing to come to Asia because of that. They would fly and they would have the family adventure around, you know, getting their hip or their, you know, their teeth done or whatever. And they save money at the time, and they have a great experience, and the staff there speak English and so on. So that whole idea of building from scratch by saying, okay, we don't have any incumbent interest here, let's just build around what customers want. In that way, Asia has a distinct advantage. And I find that really fascinating, because we're seeing that in healthcare, we're seeing it in retail, and like the example you bring up, Unmish, for example, in media now as well. You know, how will that change everything? I just find that fascinating, that I think we're at the beginning of it.
It's sort of, your point about healthcare as a service in Thailand, again, echoes the previous point about China making that jump from being a manufacturing hub to a services hub. And even services, if you look at it from in the Indian context, from 25 years ago, the offshoring piece around tech, again, that sort of went from an outsource to a KPO, to a knowledge-based piece. And the other example I can think of ancillary to Thailand is wellness. The amount of wellness centers in India, which are, and that's also, I think, a confluence of trends where Indian social habits and norms of diet, meditation, mindfulness, yoga, all that is now actually gaining traction. Michelle, you're a yoga teacher yourself, and then the whole move towards vegetarianism, and it just happens. And in India, English is very widely spoken, and real estate outside of the metros is quite affordable. You put it all together, and you can have a 100-bed resort in the lower Himalayas or the Ghats or the Nilgiris, and actually it makes a difference. So there's a confluence of things happening on the demand side. There's a confluence of things happening on the supply side, and then people are taking initiative to actually create something at a service at a very quality service level.
Great. Well, we talked about confluence. Let's talk about the opposite of confluence. What would that be in English?
Dissonance.
The dissonance. Let's talk about dissonance, Frank, because you write a great article in Forbes, and I want to bring that one up now. And you describe yourself, I think, to preface this, as an optimist. So.
Long-run optimist.
A long-run optimist.
But you're going to have pain. You're going to have some pain. You're going to have dislocation in the short run.
All right.
I mean, pain. The friction is almost a pricing mechanism to get you to some kind of resolution, right?
Right.
So you've got to inflict. You don't have to, but we're now at a point where people are inflicting hardships on the market in order to, extract this price, and that will then theoretically get us to some kind of equilibrium.
Right, so we're moving in a good direction in the long run.
In the long run.
There you go. So let's talk about this. So this is an article by Frank Lavin in Forbes a week ago, and it says that as the US-China trade war reaches half-time, okay, what can we expect in coming months? So where are we now, and what can we expect?
Well, more tariffs are expected to be put in place Friday, by the end of the day today, in Asia time. So President Trump has said he is going to sanction $200 billion of Chinese exports with a 25% tariff. So a rather steep, rather blanket, pervasive attempt. So that is, I think, universally viewed by business as bad news, and it's going to punish consumers as well. So that's a step back for economic growth. But my point is that might eventually get you some kind of outcome. Certainly the Trump point of view is we're doing this because it's the only way to rattle China and to get China to move to fix some of these problems we have. So we're going to throw a few logs on the fire here, get something really burning, and then hopefully we're all going to get a better result.
Historically, is that the way to do it? Is that a new sort of...
Nobody's done it this way. Historically, people have focused on specific problems. I mean, they've delineated and said, we're unhappy because you, China, are subsidizing steel, and it's unfair, it's harmful to us, and so we want that fixed, and we'll spend 6 months sort of talking about that and maybe get some kind of response from China. But Trump has said, look, we're unhappy with China, A to Z, and we're putting tariffs on A to Z. So nobody's done that. And there's not a clear list of requests from the United States, which complicates negotiations. Not a clear statement of bill of particulars. What is it that you want to have fixed? So if you put that together, it's that would not make you optimistic. But if you look more than a few months, I think you could see something coming out.
Progress. You said it's half time, so
yeah.
In the grand scheme of things, what does that mean? Time
to
regroup?
I'm also trying to set in sort of terms of tone that it's going to get worse before it gets better. That you're going to have these tariffs put in place by the United States. China said, well, we'll respond with our own tariffs. There'll be a little bit of ill will and some economic friction that generates out of that. It'll percolate through the U.S. economy. There's already unhappiness because these tariffs increase input costs for businesses, and they're going to put downward pressure on employment, spike inflation and consumer costs and so forth. So there's going to be a ripple effect, but that can take a few months to bubble through, right? And then I think you get some kind of consensus out of that.
Frank, I was just curious, given your sort of breadth and length of experience, could you sort of point to 2 or 3 other similar phases or states of impasse, 70s, 80s, 90s, where there was the world was sort of waiting with bated breath because of the macroeconomic impact. The variable may have been different. It may not have been employment or manufacturing. It could have been physical security. It could be oil security. It could have been food.
Well,
and just to give us some context.
This is a sort of a standalone case in terms of the magnitude of the Chinese economy. However, if you go back to late 1980s, 1990, you'll see U.S.-Japan trade friction be quite considerable. Enormous unhappiness about somewhat same issues. Japan is viewed as mercantilist. It's viewed as predatory. It's viewed as taking full advantage of U.S. being a relatively open market. Japan's relatively closed. Americans can't sell beef into Japan. I remember one trade minister of Japan saying, we won't let you sell your skis because our snow is different. It's not healthy. We won't let you sell your beef because our digestion is different. So it's we're just going to adopt a reasonably protectionist policy toward that, and that results in a lot of unhappiness in the United States and a series of trade actions. Nonetheless, none of them were blanket across-the-board tariffs. There were different tariffs against Japanese motorcycles, Japanese cars, Japanese steel. So there are different actions at different times. Japan still remains reasonably closed of the major economies, not as closed as China. But also, I'd say Japan has suffered for closeness because it went into sort of 20 years of flat economic activity, because that's one of the problems with closing an economy is you lock yourself in. You don't subject your economy to stimulation. So it's not just for United States' benefit, but it's also for Japan's own benefit that open economies move ahead.
An observation on a question. So was that sort of Reagan-Nakasone around that time?
Yeah, it started. Certainly there were problems with Reagan, and it became. And as you remember, the late '80s, that's where Theory Z and the Japan that can say no, and this whole sort of the series of sort of economic business schools of thought that said, look, Japan's really cracked the code. Japan has sort of taken market economics but improved it and managed it better, and we've sort of lost out, and we've got to kind of mimic them. Now, we hear some of that from China today. They've sort of beat us at our own game, and we need to take stock of that.
I seem to recall, was it Sony which bought Columbia TriStar?
Yes.
And that again, it was a very, when you start looking at manufacturing plants and steel, it's one level of connect and emotion. When you start looking at slightly softer sectors, it becomes far more emotive.
Sure. Well, they bought Rockefeller Center. They bought Pebble Beach Golf Club. So they're buying trophy real estate properties, which, look, I took at that time as this is a sign of a bubble economy. This is the time as these fellows have too much money and they're spending it foolishly, right? But in America, in some quarters, there was sort of a neuralgia to say it's a sort of a plot to seize our iconic institutions and what they're going to tow them to Japan, I guess.
Well, they bought the sunflowers as well by Van Gogh, right? That was bought by a Japanese businessman. So
and that was more individual as opposed to corporations and governments. So there were different levels, and I'm looking at Rwanda buying, I think, Lionsgate, and again, that's becomes very emotive. My question, follow-on question really was, just as you were saying that there may have been a window of opportunity for Japan to grow by being open, could the boot be on the other foot with the US perhaps bringing up the barricades as well over a 10, 15-year period?
Well, I would say be careful to Americans. I would say closed economies stagnate. You're not, when you protect the U.S. steel industry, who inevitably are you helping?
Well, exactly.
And good political leadership, good economic stewardship means you're helping these businesses adjust. You're not locking them into a 2017 model. And we know, given technology changes, societal changes, that there's got to be an evolution in every industry. So U.S. auto industry uses about half the amount of steel per car today that they did 20 years ago, right? It's not China, it's not Japan, it's technology, it's material sciences, it's composite plastics and so forth that are now better to use in a car. So that trend could keep going. And what about this trend toward electric vehicles? It's only something like 1% of vehicles now, but it will be 5 or 10%, meaning if your job is to make a carburetor or to make spark plugs, demand's going to drop. So what is your future? How much higher wage can you command in that kind of environment? So these companies need to start thinking about a post-combustion economy and how they're going to participate in it.
Now, do you think, because you see that the trade war, the trade and the tariffs that are going to affect, I think, America a lot more than it will China, because with the new Belt and Road Initiative, China can look to fulfill some of its deficits here and in that whole pipeline of production and goods and things like that. I mean, how do you foresee? I know you said it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. Yeah. But and we talked about isolationism on the part of America, and it seems that yes, I mean, China might take a bit of a hit, but it can look toward these other areas.
Well, Michelle, I think both parties can. I don't know whether you call this good news or bad news, but both economies are performing pretty well.
Yeah.
And the trade in the scheme of GDP is smallish, and then you're putting a percentage tax on top of that. So you're injecting costs, and you're not helping the economies, but it's modest. I think Congressional Budget Office said these tariffs will decrease GDP growth by 0.1%. So that's not good news. But when you're hitting 3% growth, anyhow, last quarter I think it was above 3. It was 4% last quarter. That's a tolerable. And China's, I think, in a strong position as well, 5.5% growth. So if it punishes them, they'll still be around.
Yeah.
What about, for example, you've drawn the analogy with Japan, and back in the 80s, Japan didn't have Asia really by comparison to trade with. And I think if you look at the latest data, that Asia does more trade with itself than it does with the rest of the world now. Sure. So that's a really interesting factor. Does that sort of change the playing field? Is it
well, and it's China's home market. China's got a domestic economy, has domestic consumption, so it's not sort of Hong Kong 1965 where they said all we're doing is cranking out polo shirts for the world, and if somebody stops buying it, we're dead. But they've got a modern, complicated economy of which trade is a factor. So it's not good news, but their GDP will still be at that 5%, 5.5%, regardless of whether those tariffs are there or not.
Right. So the second part of the question, as you've outlined in your headline, what can we expect in coming months?
I think these tariffs go into place. I think China responds and puts tariffs into place. I think you add additional cost to the U.S. economy. And I think there's an undercurrent of unhappiness because of that, but I think it takes several months to sort of mature. And but then I think there's going to be some appetite on the U.S. side for cutting the deal and some appetite on the China. That's why I'm an optimist. But you've got to sort of go through the trough to get to a happier end or some kind of equilibrium ending.
Yeah, I wonder if it affects like the issues we're talking about earlier on with talent, because obviously, you know, I suppose later on in any kind of trade war, it's the movement of people that get impacted as well, isn't it? Especially if somebody was going to study in China, you know, whether they will put embargoes on, you know, American students going to study in. I mean,
no, I'll give you a little bit of good news in this situation, which is tellingly, none of the rhetoric from the United States goes beyond being critical of China on trade issues, and President Trump typically makes it a point to compliment President Xi. And China also behaves in those parameters. It's not calling for boycott of American goods. It's not going on anti-American tirade. So I don't see contagion. I mean, it's not good news. It's not going to help the bilateral relationship. But both sides have set up parameters. So there's a It's a bit of a fist fight, but it's in a controlled environment. So I don't think it affects tourism or student activity or broader interaction, right? But look, you're never going to have this kind of a bad news, and even if you go back to status quo ante, you're not going to say, well, we're all friends again, right? Meaning the second order effect is going to be China saying, we're going to put $1 billion into soybeans in Brazil because we don't want to be so reliant on U.S. soybean production. And it's going to be a third country manufacturer saying, we are going to have an internal rule here at Apple that no more than 30% or 40% of our smartphones are going to be made in China because there's just concentration risk. So you're going to have people adjust. They're going to move away from efficiency and simplicity to hedging and portfolio distribution, which is going to have an economic cost to it, but that's to be expected.
And a benefit to some.
It'll be a benefit, and there'll be better hedge. It'll help countries such as Vietnam or Bangladesh, Mexico that might benefit from places, right? And at the margin, China's going to lose some investment, and U.S. will lose some investment.
Fantastic and fascinating as well. And we'll put the article by Frank in the show notes. Go and check that out if you want to go a bit deeper and zoom into that issue. Lastly, Michelle, you've brought up the Fab 50. Talk us through the Fab 50. What is it and why do we need to know about it? So this is from Forbes, right?
Yes,
the Fab 50.
The Asian Fab 50. Every year Forbes goes and reviews the companies that have had more than $2 billion success. They then sift through it even more to entrepreneurial companies that have no more than 50% state-owned investment into it. And they've sifted through and they've looked at basically the best of Asian companies in Asia. And you see every year that there is a dominance by India and China, which China has moved ahead quite significantly this year to have 30 of the 50 companies on this list. But you also see drop-offs, like Malaysia has one company and Singapore is no longer on the list as any companies. And a lot of companies from India and Vietnam India has the second largest amount of companies here, but all different industries and all different things. So again, it goes back to the shift of China, and you used to see it as this manufacturing hub. And then, of course, with the 5-year plan, the more emphasis is placed on innovation and placed on service and placed on these other aspects. You can see it in this year's 50 companies, 50 of the best.
What surprises Michelle? What do you see on the list that kind of surprised you?
Well, what I see on the list is there are two manufacturers in India, two auto manufacturers in India, and they're two very different. There's one that manufactures trucks and buses, and then the new one is now scooters. And so I find that that's an interesting thing because it also we all are in Singapore. We all see this, more competitive nature about like higher cars and, scooter cars and in Southeast Asia. So I find that that's really interesting.
Is that Royal Enfield? Was that the motorcycle company? Was that the scooter company you're referring to, or was it somebody else?
Mahindra is the truck one, yeah. And then the other one was, I'll have to dig them out. Yeah. Is it maybe the Leyland, Ashok Leyland? Or maybe, I can't remember which is which.
That's interesting because Enfield actually is a motorbike company. Right. And Leyland used to be buses.
Yeah.
So they've gone from 4-wheel to 2. Right. And Mahindra, which has always been in Jeeps, from big supplier of the army, and now going into sort of heavy duty, which is very, very interesting. Evolved. And Tata, which actually has done both, they're sort of playing in other sectors.
And so they're two very different companies, and I find that that's really interesting, and it's kind of exciting to see that, because they both have pulled ahead and they both have a different value proposition that they offer.
But does that show you that one of India's comparative advantage is a very large domestic market? So if you're doing something right, like building a truck, you've got this huge consumer base for it, and then you can use that to amortize off, just build out global distribution out of that. That's sort of what it suggests to me. Is that?
Yeah, that's true, and also that you have you work with different economies within Asia, work with different global economies to be able to be the supplier, and that to me is pretty interesting because
and a little bit like China's advantage, meaning it's making products that are for the mass market, and they're not trying to be elite trucks. They're trying to be. So if you're running an agricultural plantation in Indonesia and you say I need 40 trucks,
right?
Mahindra is very appealing, right?
Yeah.
These will do the job. These will do the job, but they might not have air conditioning. They might not have FM radio. They might not even have really good shock absorbers. But you'll be very happy with the outcome of these jobs of this truck. So they fit that.
Actually, it's interesting the point you're raising, Frank, because if you look at China, sort of mid-90s onwards, when sort of there was a lot of growth at a provincial level. And if you look at India, sort of 2005 onwards, where the whole notion of an A town and a B town, we still had 10 million people,
right,
as opposed to Delhi having 25, but you have 1,000 of those towns. And that's just opened out areas and avenues of growth for businesses which didn't exist a decade ago. If you take mobile handsets, iPhones were very much dominant within that top 1% in the metros. Then came the Samsungs, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. But Oppo and Vivo went bottom up.
right.
They went very much to the A town and the B town, and captured all of that because of a very different price point. And that's a great point you brought up, because demand's actually not necessarily top down only; it's bottom up as well.
Sure.
Well, there's that pattern, isn't there, that replicates throughout these countries where they have a demographic advantage, which they convert into a competitive advantage, and that then becomes an innovation advantage, right? And we're sort of going through that phase, aren't we? That the demographic advantage is you have access to 300 million people who can work for very little money compared to the rest of the world. That then converts into cash, which they can then convert into AI or data science, which is, we're going through that sort of cycle, aren't we? So what starts as cheap trucks for agricultural purposes becomes later on, maybe the future Tesla coming out of Asia. I mean, that would be interesting.
I'll add to that, because we see this in U.S. exports. About 10% of the value of U.S. exports can be imported. So it's an open trade regime that allows you to be competitive internationally. But India's gone through this very impressive transition over the last few decades. So if you were a truck manufacturer 30 years ago, you said you may only source from India. And you're just not going to be competitive. And nowadays there's going to be some odd bit of software or some odd tech bit or whatever. They say we buy this from Germany or we get it from China or something. But it really helps the global competitive posture of these trucks. So now they can source from any place in the world. You've got modest tariff regime in motor vehicles.
That's a great example. Growing up in Delhi, 80s and 90s, the whole idea of somebody having a spare parts retail business, we almost from your rear view mirror to the kind of pedal you use to bring the window down, actually added value to a car, which at that time was quite basic. Right. And I think it was the ability to import those components, which actually suddenly made the domestically made product significantly better. Just pure anecdotal.
Okay, so that's the Fab 50 list, topped by the obvious two candidates, Alibaba and Tencent, which combined market value of just under $1 trillion. I know everybody's talking about the $1 trillion club. They're halfway there. They're there together, Alibaba and Tencent. What I find fascinating when I look through this list is just how many of these companies I don't know. For example, if you were to scroll down, and with all due respect to them if they're watching, but Foshan Haitian Flavoring and Food Company, they're in the top 10. Yeah. So these, and as a, somebody who's inside Asia, I should know better, really. But for outside, if you don't know these companies, well,
what's interesting is one of the companies, iQiyi, who is in Mongolia, they produce dairy products, and in the 2012 Olympics in London, they did not export any of these milk products to London, but yet they took these big ad campaigns on the sides of double-decker buses just to have that awareness of, and the messaging was, we create these health products, and they may not be so well known outside of China, but a lot of the companies are.
Absolutely.
I think if you take a 30-year timeline of growth and development across the world, language has played a very, very big part. The fact that the UK was, and England and Australia and the UK, the US and Oz are fundamentally Anglophonic countries, Anglophonic media, Anglophonic cultures, that critical mass is extremely large and extremely high. I've always believed, and I think Michelle and I have spoken about this, there's a business out there which actually creates the Wired of China. A magazine which basically tracks what is happening in terms of innovation around tech and digital in China, just as Wired began back then in the Valley 20 years ago. Because there's so much happening, but the language remains a barrier to our awareness, let alone comprehension, appreciation, just awareness.
Talking about 30 years timelines, there was a piece of data, and I'll bring this up maybe for the future show, but just sort of rounding up today, just to show where we've come from as well. If you go back, and I think it was dated 1989, and it was a comparison on the left-hand side of the top 50 companies by market cap in the world, and then on the right-hand side today. And obviously today it's going to be the Apples and the Amazons and so on. Right. But the fascinating fact, and they've been brought up today already, 1989, 32 of the top 50 companies in the world were from Where do you think?
The US.
No, Japan.
Japan, yeah.
Phenomenal.
There you go.
Point.
I mean,
Great
obviously
point.
at that point with the
How much
end
was the US?
Well,
After
probably
18.
15.
No, but if you look at the
there was like
branding-
Shell, and maybe that was it.
The branding, like even the logos that they had, there was a comparison about, the Japanese companies, their branding was all English letters, and, so
the language which comes in.
Canon, Fujitsu, and all of these, Sony.
Yeah, well, where are they now? There you go. It's been fascinating. It's been fascinating sharing this with you, and thank you so much for being good sports on the first daytime Asia Matters and sharing your insights and opinions and your articles. We'll put all the details in the show notes. Michelle Wonderland, Frank Lavin, and Unmish Parthasarathi. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's a
Thanks
wrap.
very much. That was great.
Thank
Well done,
you.
you.
It was fun.